This is Understanding React.js at Twin Cities DrupalCamp. The slide deck is already available, so you can follow along if you want. My name is Mauricio Dinarte. You can find me as dinarcon on Twitter, Drupal.org, pretty much anywhere. That's my email if you want to send questions after the session. I am from Nicaragua, beautiful place. I have been here in winter and it's quite cold. So if you want to escape the winter and go to a place warm with beaches and beautiful nature, good option. I'm part of Agaric. We are a company with people all over the place. And I am also passionate about teaching. So I am actually at the moment studying French because I want to be able to present sessions like this and trainings in another language to be able to help more people. And in that website, it's a personal project that I hope that will get better over time. But the idea is to be able to teach in text and video formats in 3 different languages. So that's my goal. And to get into why we're all here, why do we want to use React? What's all the hype about it? One of the biggest selling points of React is that you are supposed to be able to learn once and write everywhere. And that means once you learn to work with the React model, you should be able to write applications for the web, for mobile, for virtual reality, for the desktop, and so on. This is possible because the library itself is separate from what is called the renderer. That means that something else that's going to translate your code into native code in the platform that you're going to use. So if you're using the web, you're going to get HTML, CSS, and so on. If you're using React for writing mobile applications, they will be compiled to their native alternatives both in iOS and Android. You can also use that for virtual reality applications, desktop applications, and so on. There are about 15 renderers, and you can find them in that URL. You can use React, for example, to write PDF documents, to write, to create SVGs, images, and so on. So have a look at that. But the idea is, once you learn to use the framework, you can create so many different types of application. Another thing is that React doesn't impose you to create the whole application with React. You can have only bits and pieces written in React, and as your needs grow or as the project permits that, you can keep converting more parts into React until all the application becomes a React application. For example, imagine that you have a Drupal website. You might have from the whole website just one of the blocks being powered by React. Maybe you want to have then a whole page, and at some point you might want to decouple the whole Drupal site and just use it as a backend, and React becomes your frontend. So there are many possibilities around this, and we are going to do a live demo where we're going to start from a static page, and we're going to start creating a React application from there. React also has a great developer experience. For once, it is a library, not a framework, and you can say that binaries are not included. That means that there is a small API surface to learn. Is that you don't really need to memorize a lot of functions and things in your head. It's like 5 or 7 things that are used very often, and that suffices for everyday development. That doesn't mean that React is not powerful or not capable of doing other things that, for example, Vue or Angular, which are frameworks themselves, can do. There are many extra libraries that you can integrate with React to provide those functionalities, but the library itself, like the core, is very lightweight. Another thing is that React uses existing JavaScript constructs for developing applications. That means that, for example, for templating, instead of using their own markup or inventing their own way to do things, they simply use plain JavaScript to create the templates. And we're going to see some example of that. But basically, you don't have to learn anything new other than JavaScript itself to be able to write applications and templates in React. It has very good error reporting. Like when you get an error, it will actually tell you the line, and sometimes will give you like a URL to the documentation and the exact things that you need to put in the code to fix the problem. So it's really good in that regards, and it also has very good developer tools. It is very easy to get started, and even though it is a JavaScript application, and for production, you will very likely use a build process to get started. You don't need any of that. And this is even like an analogy to Drupal. When I started with Drupal almost a decade ago, just getting a Lambda stack set up to be able to install Drupal was a pain. It would take hours or days. It could be very frustrating and demotivating because of not being able to start right away with Drupal itself, like being able to start tweaking with the platform. With React, you can use a service called onPackage that we're going to use in the example, or Code Sandbox, that it's basically a few lines of code, and you have React available to be able to use it. And that way you can test it, and if you like it, then you can dig deeper. But to get started, it is very easy. And one of the very nice things that React has is that over time it has changed its API, and when they do that, they release something that is called code mods. That is an application that will automatically update your code base. You can find them in that URL, but like, for example, at some point they migrated some of the configuration that they have in core into separate libraries, and that required modifying like how you work, like the whole code base. And you basically run one command, it inspects all your code, and it does the transformation for you. We use this for a project that it was written in Backbone, and at some point we wanted to migrate to React. And by using like 3 to 4 of these tools, like it's just like literally 30 seconds running, and then most of the applications is converted to the new API. It is not perfect. Sometimes you need to go check and manually modify some things, but it gets you a long way in the upgrade process. I wish Drupal were that easy, but well, hopefully from 8 to 9 and so on, we are promised that it's going to be really easy to upgrade. But at least with React, even if there are breaking changes, they provide tools to make the upgrade process very easy. React is also widely adopted. Similar to Drupal, there is a vibrant community, a lot of people willing to help, producing documentation. There are big companies using React, which have very big needs. So it is battle tested. For example, Facebook, Instagram, NFL, Netflix. There are many Microsoft, well, a lot of companies using React. And it is very performant, and it is able to do many things. Also, it is in hype at the moment, in very high demand, and the jobs, if you know React, abound, and they are very well compensated. And if you already have experience with some front-end libraries, for example, Bootstrap or Material UI, there are already integrations that you can use right off the bat. So you just install an extra package, and you have these extra libraries at your disposal. And you can find more about the usage and popularity of React in the first link, and many good references to things that are possible to do with React in the second one. And what about X, Y, and Z? There are many questions that come about when we talk about React. Accessibility. Using React doesn't make an application more or less accessible. In fact, Ryan, I don't remember his last name, but he's with React Training and the author of a library called Rich UI, that is a library for building React components that are accessible by default. And he tweeted that using React, it's like, okay, maybe 16% of the application is less accessible. But compared to other libraries, React is better in terms of number, but in the end, React is just like a renderer. What is going to get rendered is what you decide to produce. So it is not that the React is inaccessible, it is that the code that you are producing is not optimized, and that can be fixed and changed. If you want to use SEO, there is a library called React Helmet, and it's interesting because this one was created by the NFL, so they decided to call it Helmet. And that's for SEO purposes. If you want to build websites with React, you can use a library called Gatsby or a project called Gatsby. If you want to power enterprise applications with server-side rendering and so on, you can use React.js. And if you're worried about performance, well, don't worry, React itself is already performant. It includes some tools that can make it even more performant, but by default, it is really, really fast. And that's one of the things that make it very popular at the beginning, and it still holds true today. In that URL, you can find like benchmark of different libraries, and you will find that React, is really good in this regard. Now, if you want to get started into React, how much ES6 do I need to know? ES6 is like, well, not so new anymore, but like a new version of the language that incorporates a lot of new syntax and ways to program in JavaScript itself. Really, what you already know is enough to get started. You don't need to learn all of ES6 to be able to be proficient with React at the very beginning. These are some of the things that are common in everyday React application development, like the construction of array and objects, spread and rest operator, string literals, and so on. I think that probably the more important ones are understanding the binding of these and arrow functions, and understanding object mutations. But the truth is that because React uses core JavaScript constructs, the better React developer that you become means that you are getting better on JavaScript itself. And if at some point you want to move to another project, library, or just write core JavaScript, you have learned a lot already. React uses some functional programming concepts as well that, it's very interesting. And in that in that URL, there is like in one blog post like a summary of all you need to know to get started with React. Something that you can read in about 10 minutes suffices to just get started and familiarize yourself with the syntax. Talking about syntax, that is one of what code mods are able to do. If you are not using the new version of the language, ES6, there is like a code mode to be able to update to that if you want. And let's talk about let's see an example of how this works. Let's go from elements to components to full applications and what all of this means. So this is the live demo, and of course, nothing can go wrong. The repository is there. Probably you are familiar with lorem ipsum, which is just like random text that doesn't mean anything really and just a placeholder. The idea is that instead of reading the text, people will focus on what you want to show or demonstrate in a particular concept. So instead of using lorem ipsum, I use Spanish. Spanish is my native language, and the examples, strings are in Spanish, so that instead of trying to read, you focus on the code that I want to show. I promise that at some point I will put that in English because it makes sense for other people to understand. But for this one, bear with me. It's not necessary to understand what it says, just like to what I want to demonstrate. Okay. So this is the repository. It is pretty simple. I would recommend that you visit the list of commits. And it is like starting from scratch, from a static site, all the way to like little by little how to convert this into a React application. This is the app, if you will. This is the starting point, just like very, very basic and minimal HTML. But again, the focus is to learn the React part. And in the end, this is like the end product. You will be able to have the same thing rendered by React. You will be able to have buttons to like upvote something. And when you upvote, the interface automatically sorts itself. And you have another button to add more elements to the list. So again, like it is intentional, very plain, so that we can focus on the building parts of React. Hopefully everyone can see. And this is the site. Very basic HTML structure in totally plain HTML and CSS at this point. The CSS is like very, very light as well, just like a couple of things. So let's say that if I come back to the site, I want to start little by little. the only thing that I want to change at the very beginning is this string here. I want to convert this into a React application, just one line. How do I do that? So if I go to the code, the first thing to do is I need to import the libraries. And this is where I mentioned you can use some package to just call the script tags for React, which is the core library, and React DOM, which is the one that is going to be able to produce the HTML. Like React DOM is the renderer for the web. With those two lines there, you create a JavaScript file, and basically this is all you need. React.createElement. Oh, one more thing before that. You need to import that script file that we're going to create. So otherwise it won't be loaded. So the script file itself, we're calling React.createElement. That's like an element is the most atomic part of a React application, and it is a representation of something that the user will see on the screen at some point. And we're going to come back to this word representation because it's very important. But just to get started, let's say I want to create a p tag, and this is the text that I want to use. We're going to see what the second parameter to the function is in a moment, but just by doing this and storing it in a variable, this variable is already a React element. So that's already React. But then how do I tell React to put that into the DOM, into the web page itself? I need a reference to a mounting point. So in my HTML, like the line that before I have that line. So now I just like replace that line by an ID with an ID of app. This can be anything that you want, but the point is you need a mounting point for the React application. When you have that, you get a reference in the JavaScript to that mounting point. So document get element by ID app, and then you use the renderer, which is React DOM. React DOM.render. I want to render this element into that mounting point, and by doing that, you already. This is the result. You already have a React application. There is one thing, if you pay close attention, in the static version you have some text in bold. In this version you don't have text in bold, but that's already an indicator that React is doing something here. And if we inspect the source code, which I highly recommend when you start working, you see that deep ID app. So we are sure that this is being rendered by React. Yesterday, some colleagues and myself were presenting training on migrations, and one of the things that we said is celebrate the small successes. Like try the minimum thing first, make sure that they work, and build up from there. Because like if you try to do everything at once and something fails, it is harder to find why it fails if there are several moving parts or things changing at the same time. So like as a general recommendation, start from the very basics. Okay, that's one line. So React is already doing something. Let's say that we want to do something else. Let's say that I want to bring back the bold text. So one way to do that is nesting elements. Elements can be nested as many as you need. So the way that it works is when you call create element, the first parameter is the type of element that you want to create. The second are the properties that we're going to cover in a moment. And the third is an array, or just like a list separated by commas of what things you want to show. In this case, I'm saying I want to show some text. Then I want to create a new React element. And then I want to show some other text. And the element that I am creating in the middle is going to be a strong tag with no properties whatsoever and with some text that is going to be at some point become bold. But basically what I'm doing here is nesting one element into another. By doing that, if I go to the website, this is the result, basically the same. And if I inspect the source code, I can see that I get that div with an ID of app, the p tag, some text, the strong tag, and then some more text. So little by little, I am able to construct the application. But you might be, looking at this and it's like pretty weird. And if you have, complex sites or even simple ones, like they have a lot of nesting elements, it would be, I would say, impossible for a human to keep track of all of these hierarchies, nesting, and so on. So there should be a better way to do that. Before going to the better way to do that, or an easier way to do that, I want to talk about this null second parameter that we're passing there. Those are properties. Properties are things that are going to modify my React element, and there are many of them. One of them is ClassName. If I use the ClassName property, this is an object. What you pass is an object, and in this case I have a key called ClassName and then a value subheading. What this is doing is at the moment that it gets rendered to the HTML, it is going to become the class of the tag. So if I come here, by passing ClassName, now my p tag is going to have a class with the value that I decided. In this properties array, I can pass, for example, an style tag, which is an object, and I can say I want to put the color, anything that basically that CSS supports, I can put here. There is a catch. There are like 4 or 5 different differences between regular React and JavaScript, and at some point I'm going to explain those differences, but basically the second argument is an object with some properties that are going to modify the element itself. So that being said, this becomes cumbersome. I want an easier way to write code. So an easier way to write code is using something that is called JSX. JSX is an HTML-like syntax inside JavaScript. So this is actually a JavaScript file, but as you can see, it has some things that look like HTML. This is invalid JavaScript. If you try to load this into the site, it will fail. Why? Because it is invalid syntax and it will give you an error. So how to go about that? You enable or you install something that is called Babel, which is a transpiler. So it's going to convert that code into like regular JavaScript that the browser understands. And in addition to importing Babel, in my case, because I am importing the JavaScript separately, I need to specify that this script is not regular JavaScript, it is text Babel, so that when the browser reads that, it will perform the transformation of the code before producing the content, and that way it will get executed. So this is very easy to read compared to the previous version. And as you can see, I can nest element. This is an element that has been nested, and then you get the results from before. Again, like in here, you can say, for example, for that, you can use any attribute that is available in HTML. I can have an ID of something, and so on. Usually in HTML, you can have a class property like this, an attribute like this, but then remember that this is JavaScript. Inside of JavaScript, the word class is a reserved keyword, so you cannot use that name like out of the box. That's why we have to put class name. The same is, for example, if you have labels, you can say label for something else. For is another keyword in JavaScript, so it's an alternative. You have a different name that you're going to use. In the case of styles, you can, even though it's probably not a good idea to do, you can have inline styles for some elements. The difference is that instead of passing a string, in React you pass an object. And those objects, instead of having like dashes to separate the words, is like a camel case syntax. Again, it is only like 4 or 5 things that are different, and you can like Google those differences between JSX and regular HTML, and it's like 1 page. But that's just like for you to know as a reference. And again, we are just like rebuilding the same application over and over, just adding small pieces every time. Let's say that now I want to I want to, instead of replacing only one line, I want to modify like the whole header of my site. So I remove the code related to the header, and I just put the div ID there. That is going to be my mounting point. And here I say, now what I'm going to render with React is a header with a h1 inside of it, with a p and a class, and inside that a strong. So like instead of being one line, now I have a whole section, and everything else is exactly the same. You can just like start from the small to big, as much as needed. And after having React elements, the next concept is React components. So what is a React component? A React component is a function that you can reutilize as many times as needed to render something on the screen. So what do you need to know about React components? For one, they are functions. So you have the function, the block of the function. They need to return something. That something is a React element in itself, and they have to be their name needs to start with an uppercase. Why? Because what this is going to become at the end is going to be translated into React create element. And for example, let's say I have React dot create element, and remember that the first parameter to the function is the type. If I say header, there is already in HTML a component called header, and it might conflict with it. So the way that React differentiates between core HTML tags and custom components that you create is that checking that the first letter is uppercase. So all your components need to start with an uppercase. And by doing this, then you can say null, and then all the things that you want to render in that component. But basically, you just start with a capital letter, make it a function, and make it return a React element. And by doing that again, I come to my site, and now all the header is being rendered by React. One thing about components is that they can be reused. And actually, that's the whole point of having components. In this case, the header component, I'm only using it once, so it might not make a lot of sense in this case, but it doesn't matter. Like, you can have it if you need it. So another way, something else that you can do is that you can have a movie component. A movie component, in this case, is going to render the title of the movie, when it was published, and the image. And then you are going, in this case, I am rendering the same component 3 times. So like I am delegating the responsibility to React of also giving me this, giving me these images. So there is a problem here. Let me see. Here. So this is the code that we're looking so far. Because I have a component and I render it 3 times, I get the same results 3 times. And well, although that is okay, it is not very useful. Another benefit of having components is that in addition to being reusable, you can also customize them on a 1-by-1 basis. So how do you do that? And that's where the next concept comes, and it is the props, or properties, or props for short. So basically, you can have a component and pass some variables to that component, like if they were HTML attributes. To the movie component, the name is going to be Space Jam. The year it was released in 1996. The URL is going to be X, Y, and Z. When you pass properties to the component this way, remember this is a function, so it's going to receive a parameter. In this case, I call it props. That's the common way to do it. And when you are going to render the component, instead of hard-coding the values, you basically say, I want to print whatever is in props.name, in props.year, and in props.image URL. one thing to take into account is that when in here, this is JSX. When you are inside JSX and you want to switch to JavaScript, you put the thing in that symbol, curly braces. Thank you very much. You put them inside curly braces, and that means we're switching back to JavaScript. So inside the curly braces, you can execute any JavaScript that is valid. Like you can actually execute functions and so on. And this way, I am having a component that I can reuse as many times as I want, and for each of them, I can pass different properties. So those are props. And at this point, I am already I am already presenting different information. One thing that you might have noticed in the example is that I have this thing called React fragment. For some reasons, technical reasons, when you render a component, it can only return one top-level element. In the past, you used to have like a div, like an empty div, and then everything goes inside of that. Remember that React is not inaccessible by default. It's not producing extra markup that you don't want. It's producing what you define. So if you don't want to produce that extra div, you can use a component called React fragment, and everything goes inside of that, and then you will not have extra markup that you don't need. Only the things that you really care about. And that's one trick to not having an extraneous div on the side. Another type of component that exists, these are called functional components because for one they are a function. Another type of component that exists is class components. So the way that they work is something like this. You have, remember this is JavaScript, so class, the name of the component, extends, React component. And then you have some constructor, and you return some value. So in this example, we're going to introduce a couple of different concepts. For one, if you compare this version to the version that I showed before, when I manually render the element 3 times, in this case, what I am doing is I have those elements in some array in my JavaScript. I am simply iterated over that array to be able to print them. So it's like less repetitive, the code. So let's see what's happened here. This component, this is the render function. This is what it's going to return. I have somewhere called this.state.films. That is a variable. I'm going to come back to this in a moment. This is an array. So I can use the map function of the array to iterate over all of the elements. And this receives a function with a parameter of each of the elements, in this case film. And basically I'm saying render this component once per film. And remember to use the curly braces to switch from JSX to JavaScript and be able to operate any JavaScript that you need. Now, what is this stuff called state? The state is another concept related to props. Props are sent from one component to another, so there is an inherent parent-child relationship. The props that a component has are not modifiable. They cannot be changed. The only way for a component to change, a prop to change, is that the parent sends new values for the component. So you don't control them. On the other hand, with a state that is inside the component itself, it doesn't go anywhere else, and it can be modified and managed by the component. So it's just like a placeholder for more information about the component. So what I'm saying in this case, I have a state called films, which is an array of this that I have at the top. What you see here might be strange. In the end, I am assigning the variable an array that I already have, but then this is where functional programming comes into place and object mutation. In React, you should strive for never modifying arrays or objects directly. You should create new copies, and again, that's for different reasons, but it's like the best practice. So if you have an array and you want to make an exact copy of that array, this is the way to do it. So at some point, this will seem strange the first time that you encounter it, but once you learn the pattern, you just reuse the pattern over and over. This is for arrays, the way to do it. If you want to do the same for objects, you use a function called object.assign. But basically, it's like this. You have some elements, React elements, then you create components, and from those components, you start building your application all the way to controlling the whole thing if you want. One of the motivations in the past of creating React components is because in the past, if you wanted that your component has a state, it has to be a class component. Today, that's not necessary. There is a new API called React Hooks that allows you to have a state inside functional components as we had before. And we're going to talk about that in just briefly. So the demo didn't go as bad as I thought, so that's good. But what other concepts are useful for React? We have properties, state. What other concepts are useful? Proptypes. Proptypes is a very lightweight approach to validating that the data you're receiving is of the type that you want. For example, if you are going to render a string, a number, or execute a function, by proptypes inside the component itself, you can say, hey, I am expecting a string, and this string is optional, or this string is required. So that's another thing that you can do. If you want to go beyond, you can use something like TypeScript, for example, that has a strong typing system. But if your application doesn't need to go that way, or your team decides not to go that way, React provides via proptypes an alternative to validation of properties that get passed. Another thing is called context. In this case, the application is very simple, so the way that properties work is that you pass them from one parent to the child, and that can be sent to another child and to another child, and you can easily have 3, 4, 5 levels of deep component hierarchy, and maybe you want to pass something from the very top level to the very last level. And if you want to do that, at every level, you need to pass the prop, and so on. And it can get very tedious. So an alternative to this is using context. Context is you define the context at the top, and then with some syntax, you can use it at the very bottom without passing the props all the way through. This is how context works with class components. Again, there is a new pattern called hooks that is way simpler than this. This is just an example. Another thing that you need to be aware of is lifecycle methods. It's like in Drupal we have events or hooks. That is something that happened during the rendering of the page. React has a similar concept. For example, do you want to call an API to fetch some data before the component is mounted, before the application gets rendered on the screen? Let's say that when the application is closed, do you want to send some notification to some place to indicate that the user is no longer using the application? So it has this event-based model that similar to what we have in Drupal, and you can learn more about that there. We have hooks. Again, this is like a new pattern. The line that says cons, count, set count, equals set use state 0, that is the hook in this example. And one of the things that it allows is using a state in functional components, but it goes beyond that. It makes arguably the programming more compact. Like that, I have seen examples of the same application in both class components and hooks. And with hooks, it's very compact, the number of lines that you execute and the mental model, it's everything where you need it instead of having to have different methods inside a class that reference each other. So I really recommend you to look into that if you want to get into React. And if you are going to start by learning hook first because they are useful on their own. And that's it. I encourage you to read the repository. If you have questions, that is my email. You can reach out to me, and we want to leave the last 5 minutes to questions if there are any. So thank you very much for your time, and enjoy the rest of the conference. Yes?
How long have you been working with React?
I have been working with React for about 2 years. Yeah. Okay. Yes?
Have you worked with React and Drupal together in any cases for that time period?
Yes, actually, the way that I started to learn React was because in one of our Drupal projects, we decided to implement a portion of that project in React. And to be more specific, it is a newspaper in Germany that they sell online subscriptions. So we wanted to do the checkout process, like the cart, in React. So the way that we do it is like everything is Drupal, and only this checkout process is the React. So we create the application, we bundle the application, we send the JavaScript to the front end, and then we load it from there. And via API calls, we communicate with Drupal and with other services, and that's one way where you have a full Drupal site, and only one part of it, in this case the checkout card, is built in React. You can go fully decouple if you want, but like in our case, it's only one section of the site. Yeah. Okay. If there are no more questions, thank you very much again.